I wanted to start by asking some questions about how you got started as a cartoonist.
I actually became interested in caricature when I was really quite young, when I was a schoolboy. And I would look at cartoons and find books about cartoons and study this strange thing that is caricature. And I think that curious way of drawing, which is not academically accurate in a way, but absolutely unmistakably represents a particular individual. So this was a sort of magical and mysterious thing. And I was very interested in it and tried to learn how to do it by copying other people's work and so on. So that, you might say I got interested in cartooning and got started in it when I was about 14. But so another way of answering the question would be, when did I actually think I could do this as a living? And I knew Tim Birdsall.
Yes, yeah.
I was a friend of John Bird's, and John and Tim were great friends, and I got to know Tim. And I terrifically admired him, but I envied his life. I thought, that's just wonderful. He walks around with a sketchbook and a pen, and that's all, and he can do it all by himself. And I even babysat for him for a while, and I got to know him quite well and admired him a lot. So that was one thing. I thought, it never crossed my mind that I could do it, but I was sort of leaning that way. And I used to draw friends just to sort of amuse myself, caricatures of them. And I also knew Mark Boxer, who was editing the Queen magazine at that time. And one day he was in the apartment that I shared with a friend called Johnny Moynihan. And there were a lot of drawings of Johnny on the wall. And Mark was there having a drink or hanging out. And he said, that's just what I want for some article or other. And he commissioned me to do a caricature of a politician.
Was Mark Boxer cartooning himself at that time, or caricaturing?
He was. He did, but it was not the major thing he did. He wasn't. Yes. He wasn't as well known as a cartoonist as he later became. But he was good. He actually published a drawing of mine, and I think that time I thought, wow, I could. I mean, theoretically, you could do this. And a couple of years later, I sort of moved over from what I was doing to trying to sell drawings.
Can I go back to when you were talking about being a teenager and admiring the work of caricaturists and cartoonists? Because then, presumably that was the time when you were in New Zealand.
Yes.
So in New Zealand, were you seeing more American cartoons?
No.
Or was it a culture of British material coming over?
It was British. I mean, New Zealand was a sort of extension of England in those days. England was referred to by New Zealanders as home. We're going home. We've been home, or and there was a second-hand bookshop. I absolutely loved it in a little back street of Wellington where I lived, and there was a big table in the middle of this bookshop, and on that table there were Lilliput, full of drawings by Ronald Searle and James Boswell and André Francois and all those people, and there was Punch with all the same guys in it. And there were all kinds of film magazines that tended to have caricatures of actors and so on. So it was English, basically English. And there were the newspapers. There was a famous New Zealand cartoonist called Min Hinnick. His drawings looked very like David Lowe's cartoons, actually. And I would copy his drawings to see how to draw the Prime Minister of the day and the different politicians. I also don't quite know how it was. I must have had books of David Lowe. I was completely familiar with David Lowe's drawings. I think maybe an aunt or my mother or someone, knowing of my interest, bought me such books. I definitely had books by David Lowe, and later by Vicky. I knew who Vicky was.
So was caricaturing for you and cartooning, did it at that time have a political association that you
No,
it was
cartooning? Specifically this curious thing. I just found it completely fascinating. These drawings that, in a sense, didn't look like the person, and yet it sort of almost was the person.
That's obviously something which you find an abiding fascination.
I still do. Yeah. I love it as a thing. I still look at caricatures by people and find new people that can do it well and collect them, and I love it.
When you were talking about getting started, which cartoonist influenced you most when you were getting started in the early 60s?
Vicky,
Yes.
by miles, out there all on his own. I mean, I based my career on Vicky's work. I copied him.
Yes.
I plagiarized him. I lifted anything I stole from, anything I could do.
And did you meet him as well?
Yes, yes. I didn't know what to say to him because he was such a hero. I met him at the Establishment Club where I was working for a while, and he came in, and a friend of mine, John Fortune, introduced me to him. Said, "This is Nick Garland. He admires you. He never stops talking about you." And Vicky just looked at me, and I looked at him, and didn't know what to say to each other at all. But he did. He said to me, "Oh, then you should have one of my drawings." And I could go to the New Statesman, where there was a stack of his drawings, and I could take one, and I did.
It must have been very shortly after you joined the Telegraph in '66 that he committed suicide.
It was before.
Or was it?
64 he committed suicide.
Oh, right.
Terribly, terribly sad. Yeah, so sad. Yeah. And I was shocked and saddened by that. And I remember reading the sort of heartbreaking pieces that James Cameron and Michael Foote, his great friends, wrote about him. In fact, because my name is Nick, and because I obviously was basing my drawings on Vicky, Richard Ingham's called me Nicky. And so did Wally Fawkes. Saw one of my drawings. He said to me one day, I saw this drawing. I thought, Christ, he's back. But it was a rather flattering thing to say, because my drawings were obviously not like Vicky's drawings. He was a great, great draftsman. But
did you also admire the depth of his political commitment, that kind of passionate engagement with politics?
I admired everything about him. I admired how cultured he was. His references were so sort of wide and broad and popular and modern. He picked up on everything. I've got a drawing out there of Khrushchev and Kennedy dancing the twist together.
Yes, I saw that. Twisting. A wonderful drawing.
And then there were all the classical references he made all the time, little quotes from Oscar Wilde's plays and so on. I loved all that.
Did you feel yourself, having come back from New Zealand, to be in any way an outsider, in the way that Vicky obviously was an outsider and had to learn the references that you're talking about for an English audience?
I hate to talk about myself in the same breath as Vicky. I mean, this is that would be completely absurd. But yes, there was a kind of similarity there. Yeah. I felt like an outsider. Yeah, not exactly an outsider, because the Brits were never sort of unpleasant to me or anything like that. It was as if there was a chunk out of my life. There was some part of me or my existence or my history nobody knew anything about. It happened the other side of the world, in New Zealand. Of course, when I was in New Zealand, I felt the same, because I was an English boy. I was born in England, but I'm a sort of adopted New Zealander, brought up there. So always been a little bit to one side of wherever I was.
You mentioned Timothy Birdsall as well. I could see similarities between some of his drawings and your style. Was he an influence in that way, or?
Well, I think the crossover is between him and Vicky and Winnington, the man I mentioned to you earlier. Yes. That is to say, his drawings had that calligraphic, quick look, which appealed to me. Vicky was so huge that he tended, in my mind, that was what I saw. I mean, I admired Tim's work very, very much.
Would you see an over-ornate style or an over-finished style, the sort of work that E.H. Shepard was doing for his political cartoons in Punch? Would you see that as getting in the way of any message, a political message we're trying to put across? Is the kind of the liveliness and the life in the drawing and in the ideas, do they go together for you in a significant way?
I don't. I mean, Lowe's cartoons get their ideas across immensely powerfully, but he was the most controlled and sort of economic draftsman. So I don't think there can be any relationship between the power of the expression of the idea and the sort of stillness of the drawings. There's a very nice cartoonist said of me once, it's just incredible. You don't even finish the drawing. You know, it's fantastic. This was a sort of good thing. I probably was trying to, but I didn't actually join up the lines or something. So I definitely think there is a certain vivacity in Vicky's drawings that appealed to me, or in Tim's drawings,
yes,
or in Richard Winnington's drawings, a number of other people's drawings. But it doesn't mean that the idea comes across more strongly. It's just that I like that style.
How you work in terms of the materials that you use to create your cartoons? I think there will be interest from people who perhaps are coming into this from... Some cartoonists will work with digital, create digital originals, and some of them will work in ink on paper, and somebody like Kalman working in pencil, that sort of thing. How do you like to create your cartoons?
Well, I had a problem when I was a cartoonist, which was time. Normally, you're actually getting the drawing done late in the day. At least I always was. I would have preferred to work with Indian ink and a dip-in pen, because that's what Vicky used, and with that you can get a certain sort of complete blackness of line, which is very good. It's also very permanent, so what you're making is going to last rather than fade, like a lot of fountain penning will fade, turn brown in sunlight and so on. Indian ink is there forever. But the trouble with Indian ink is it takes forever to dry. So I would do a drawing in Indian ink, and then I'd get a sort of hairdryer or something and try and blow it dry. But maybe maybe it would take up to 15 minutes or something like that to actually dry, so that I could then put watercolor on it without it smudging. And that 15 minutes was an age, when the deadline is only 3/4 of an hour away, or maybe even an hour away, and you've got a long way to go yet. So I tended not to use Indian ink for that reason. So what it meant was I would have to use materials that were going to be waterproof, because I was going to have to use a wash on it, or watercolor. I would tend to use sort of little, I don't know what they were, kind of little pen. They didn't have nibs. They had not felt tip, but just they were little pens really that are used by architects, things like that. But you don't get any variation of line. Yeah. There's a word for these sort of pens. I don't know what they're called, but it is waterproof, the line.
They're the sort of rotoring pens.
Yes, a sort of rotoring pen. So that's what I would sort of have to fall back on. This is particularly true when colour came to be used, because I knew I was going to have to use watercolour on it. So it had to be, whatever the ink outline was going to have to be in a waterproof ink. So I would use these little lines. And what I liked most about a fountain pen or a dip-in pen was that you could change the line by pressing more, or turning it upside down and using the back of it. You could mess with it. And with a rotoring pen, it's just a line, and it has a certain sort of deadness to it. So when you say how did I relate, as it were, to the medium I was using, that was one big problem I had. Yeah. I didn't have time to do it the way I wanted to do it. When I was drawing before colour came in, so it was just going to be black and white, I just used to use a sort of no-nonsense fountain pen with ordinary Quink ink in it, or whatever ink I had. And then you could draw with that sort of calligraphic-y kind of thing by pressing more. I broke thousands of pens by pressing too hard. But at least you got a kind of variation of line. The actual line was interesting. But the trouble is that ink fades.
Yes.
If you put one on the wall or give one to somebody, you go and look at it a few months later, it's gone this awful sort of purpley brown colour. It's horrible. So that was a bit of a shame, but there we are.
Talking about colour, did you find that offered you new opportunities, or was it an imposition that you had to add colour where you didn't feel it was necessary?
It's rather like when the talkies came in, that people said, "Ooh, talkies! How boring!" So they rapidly thought, a silent film was extremely boring. And in movies, there were films that I thought that films are black and white. They're not supposed to be in colour. But now a black and white film looks a bit washed out. It doesn't look so good. I felt like that about colour. cartoons are black and white. Oh, I mean, go back as far as you like, until you get to Gilray, when they used to have a sort of tuppence coloured penny plain sort of thing. But that was different. They weren't in newspapers. Newspaper cartoons were black and white. But actually, of course, they offer huge opportunities. There are all sorts of things you can do with colour that you can't do in just black and white. And it was like a language that you could begin to pick up on and learn and make use of.
Did it give you a tighter deadline? Did it mean that
yes, a little bit.
It took you longer to produce a colour?
Yeah. And there were two things happened about using colour. There was a sort of coincidence of other things. The quality of reproduction became far, far better. I mean, one of the reasons why someone like Vicky or Lowe used those simple areas of dark black and a strong black line was because it was going to be printed on newsprint, which was like some horrible old sort of cardboard or blotting paper or something like that. But it printed nicely so long as you kept the drawing simple. But by now, the colour reproduction in newspapers is fantastically good. And that tends to produce a completely different sort of drawing. If you look at the people drawing now, like Peter Brooks, such as Peter Brooks or Steve Bell or Dave Brown and people, they're really making little paintings. There's a great deal of attention to the actual execution and the colours and the way they are alongside each other and the sort of shadows and sunsets and all sorts of nice things, reflections in water and so on. Yeah. These are the things that you could, you just couldn't do because the paper could not have reproduced them. Now they can. That affects the way people draw, I think. It certainly affected the way I draw. I said there were things that happened. One was the technology of painting, and the other was Steve Bell. Bell draws his cartoons very small, the same size that they're going to appear in the paper. And there's a great attention to detail. And I like looking at the way he does folds in a man's suit, or the way he does foliage in trees, or the way he does shadows in the street, or something like that. They're beautiful little paintings. And I didn't really want to, but I couldn't help sort of matching myself against him sometimes and trying to think, yeah, that's the way to do it. So I left Vicky behind because he's no longer relevant, really.
Yes.
And if there was a major influence on me in the last, I don't know, 5, 6 years, 10 years maybe, it was Steve Bell. He's had a huge influence on political cartooning, I think.
But like Vicky, he's passionately committed political animal. He goes to conferences.
I would probably criticise Vicky for being a little bit too sympathetic to Soviet Russia. It didn't distinguish between these god-awful gangsters that ran that place and other politicians around. I think there was a sort of little weakness in his political analysis, perhaps. I think Steve Bell's political analysis is pretty mad sometimes, actually. I think I sometimes look at his cartoons and think, oh, Steve, what are you on about? But I can enjoy the cartoons, and I can enjoy the sort of energy and the sort of execution of the drawings. I'm not sure that political analysis is his strongest suit.
Did you always work in the office at the newspapers, at the Telegraph and the Independent?
I liked working there. I like the atmosphere of a newspaper.
So would you go there in the afternoon,
Go there in late morning, early afternoon, about lunchtime.
And would you have an idea by then?
No, very rarely. The way news works is that it's beginning to become clear what the major stories are going to be.
Yes.
In the sort of mid-afternoon. I mean, news changes all the time. It develops all the time. There's going to be an election. There's going to be a meeting. There's going to be a battle. There's going to be a speech. And you don't know until late in the day quite what you're going to be able to do.
Isn't that daunting, going in halfway through the day when you know that the idea is going to have to come in the next few hours? Is it something you get used to?
It's what's difficult about the job. I don't mean to say that drawing isn't difficult, and you can't sort of work hard to make it better. But the real the real problem, the nightmare, is getting an idea. Once you've got the idea, even if time is short, you know you're not going to sort of have a bloody great hole in the paper. That is the problem.
Was it also exciting that
No,
kind
it's not
of uncertainty?
Exciting. It's a nightmare.
Right.
It's an absolute nightmare. It's terrifying because you've had plenty of time earlier in the day and you haven't thought of an idea. You've got the same raw material in the sense of the political situation you're thinking about, but there's only an hour to go. If you couldn't do it when there were 4 hours to go, how are you going to be able to do it now?
Yeah.
I mean, it can be a desperate feeling. You think you're going to have to kill yourself because you're going to...
Which is what Vicky did. I mean, he talked a lot in interviews
Vicky
about
didn't
the
kill himself
crisis,
because he was running out of ideas. He was incredibly prolific. When he worked on the Evening Standard, he would sometimes change the cartoon during the day. Yeah. Vicky killed himself because he had a depressive illness and he couldn't handle it, I'm afraid.
So you go into the office and you pick up from journalists, from editorial staff, what the drive of the paper is going to be the next day, what the main stories are going to be. Is that how it works?
Well, one of the things I found since I got sacked by the Telegraph and ceased to be a cartoonist, I'm not one anymore. Well, I mean, I'm not a practicing one. I suppose you could say I am one. Is that I noticed that I watch the news and television and sort of programs that are to do with current events in a completely different frame of mind. I realize I'm not on the qui-vive for a cartoon when I watch the news. I otherwise was. I wasn't aware that I was. I only became aware of it when I wasn't, if you see what I mean.
Yes.
So when you say you go into the office, you know, and you just sort of begin thinking, what am I going to do? It wasn't quite like that. You were always looking for cartoons. When you were out at dinner, listening to conversations, when you were driving down the street and you saw a poster, when you picked up the newspaper and saw a headline, you're always looking for cartoons. You might make notes. That could be a cartoon.
Yes.
A new film comes out, a new catchphrase is becoming popular all the time. So you arrive with all that sort of hinterland, as it were. I don't know quite what the word is, of thinking about cartoons. You're always thinking about cartoons in one part of your mind. And the other thing is that the news is moving in a sort of broad front. There's local news, and there's there's sort of the economy or foreign affairs or trade union stuff or just social stuff, whatever it is. And then there's foreign news, which might extend across Europe. And then there's sort of world news that could be America and the Soviet Union and China. And so there's all these different places, and they take precedence. Some are more important that day than others. Some you may have already dealt with, some they're moving so fast you don't know how they're going to be resolved, but some are just right. I know how this is going to turn out, I know what I feel about this. So you're sort of winnowing out from a number of ideas or possibilities which one you're going to do that day that you haven't done the day before, that for some reason or other.
Would you produce roughs for an editor?
No, I didn't.
At,
some cartoonists do.
Yeah.
I mean, my good friend and colleague on the Telegraph, Matt, is another very, very prolific cartoonist. He used to get into work before me, think harder than me, and so on. Lasted longer than me, but he would produce 6 roughs on one sheet of paper, and he'd walk through the office, stopping at various places where he had people who he wanted to look at the cartoons, and they would respond. And according to how they read, he would tear off 1 or 2, leaving only 3 or 4, whatever it was. And as he walked through the office, the paper got smaller and smaller, till in the end he probably showed the editor only 2. The rest were folded up and put in his pocket. I used to take them out and see if maybe there's an idea for me there. But so he produced roughs, but I didn't. I would draw roughs. I would show them possibly to colleagues, show them to Matt, or show them to other people around the office. If it was a foreign one, go to the foreign desk. An economic one, go to those guys. The leader writers were absolutely terrific like this. They seemed to know everything about everything. I would say, is the political analysis on this justified? And they would say yes or no, instruct me a little bit, and I might be able to adapt it a little bit to make it a bit more either intelligent or intelligible.
You've spoken in the past about there being a bloody great hole in the paper if they didn't accept your cartoon. Is that a status that it took you time to achieve on the paper when you were starting? Was it a different process of showing cartoons for approval, which then turned into a kind of trust between you and the editor, or was it more or less the same over the whole of your?
When I started on
career?
the paper, my cartoon moved around the paper. If it was a parliamentary thing, it would go on the parliamentary page, at forum on the forum page, and so on, occasionally on the front page. That meant that if I didn't do a cartoon, it didn't matter really. It just meant that it didn't appear anywhere. Later on, it developed that on the centre fold, opposite the editorials on the op-ed page, underneath, over the what's called the LPA, the leader page article, was my cartoon, and that's how most cartoonists work these days. So there was that space, and if I didn't fill it, it was a hole. It did matter. It mattered very, very much indeed. I mean, if at sort of 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon I just completely shot, or I just can't do an idea, it never happened.
Yeah.
But if it had, I'm not sure what the comment editor would have said. You know, you suddenly weren't going to do one, mate. Go on, go back and try again. And of course, sometimes, you know, on those terrible days, you had to just do a cartoon you'd already done, or start looking through other people's cartoons. Or, I don't know.
One thing that interests me is the question of what cartoonists, professional cartoonists, admire in other professional cartoonists, and is the ability to fill that space regularly with a high quality of cartoon. Is that something that you admire, or is it particular cartoons that they have produced over
I suppose you could say that the political analysis, the point of the cartoon, the idea, the perception, the view, whatever it is, that's a very, very important thing in a cartoon. And some people, I think, just do stupid cartoons. I mean, basically, they're saying sort of clumpingly sort of ordinary things like it's a bad idea to drop napalm on little Vietnamese children or something like that. Say, yeah, it is. I think we can agree on that. But it seemed hardly worth a cartoon if it's sort of banal, sort of obvious truth. So sometimes people get a little bit more complicated than that and sort of distinguish between subtle nuances of difference between politicians, and then I think politics and political cartoons get more interesting. They tend to be vehicles, very, very blunt and simplified ideas, but they can nevertheless be quite subtle and quite interesting, the shades of meaning that are to be discovered in them. But above all, for me, it's the actual drawing. There are people who sometimes have quite good ideas. I mean, I can see that's quite a good idea. But the actual drawing is so awful. It's so ugly and so kind of crude, and you have to sort of struggle to see who that is. You know, is that Cameron or is it Nick Clegg? You know, I think it must be Cameron because of the little mouth or something like that. But so if there was a single thing I had to say, the first thing perhaps that I respond to is the drawing. I think you can sometimes have a cartoon that has such a good idea that the execution may be a little bit careless. It does the job, but the idea is so good that the cartoon is saved. And sometimes you can have a pretty boring, pretty simple idea, hardly worth a cartoon, but the drawing is so good that, again, the cartoon is saved. It was worth it just to get that interesting, charming, maybe even exciting drawing. But these are the two things that are contending.
Yes.
When the two come together, then you've got something worthwhile.
I always find it difficult with somebody like Michael Cummings, whose style, particularly towards the end of his career, that kind of black on white, almost like a woodcut. I think the style is impressive, but the ideas, I think.
Poor Michael.
Just
he was
kind of,
he was
not to
he,
my,
he was
to
a
my
good
taste.
friend of mine, Michael, and I spent a lot of time talking to him about cartoons, and he was older than me, and he used to say to me, the trouble with you is you don't hate enough. And he was full of hate. He was actually a rather, I don't mean a violent man in real life, but in his mind he was full of hatred and contempt, and there was a sort of quite dark side to Michael Cummings. He once said of Albert Speer that he admired him very much, just the sort of guy I'd like in my club. I thought, Michael, he's a Nazi. What are you talking about? He's a terrible war criminal. So he had this sort of rather dark side. He loved drawing Nazi uniforms. He was forever drawing Tony Benn in a Nazi uniform. It was really terribly unfair. I mean, Tony Benn may be all sorts of a clown, but he's not a Nazi. But
Arthur Scargill as well, who appeared
he was
in
always
SS uniform.
Yes. Yeah. I can't remember now quite what the question was you asked me. But,
It was just about style and
style,
content
about
and
Cummings,
stuff.
yeah. Michael came, as it were, into working when Lowe was the king, because he started quite a long time ago, Cummings.
We have a copy, by the way, of one of Lowe's books that Cummings' father gave to him very early on in his career, with a dedication in the front saying, you know...
The trouble with Lowe is, if you're going to pit yourself against Lowe, you're going to lose. And Cummings was never in the sort of top league of draftsmen. He just wasn't. So for a while he was sort of eclipsed and in the shadow of Lowe. And then Lowe moved on, retired, something like that. And he thought, great, now I can be the greatest cartoonist. And along came Vicky, who immediately sort of took the position of Lowe. He was another, he already was a great cartoonist, but when Lowe went, he was the only cartoonist. Completely different from Cummings. And Cummings was always in the shadow of Vicky. Not only was that the case, but Vicky was a sort of screeching socialist, and Cummings was a mad right-winger. So I think it was rather hard on Cummings, who came between these two great men. And
it was strange that he alternated on the Express with Giles as well. It's a kind of completely different styles on alternate days.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that, is there? They were both.
They were both good cop, bad cop.
I mean, Cummings nowadays would be a very, very serious and good cartoonist, but I think the standards have slipped a bit. But he wasn't absolutely top of the range, I don't think. Sorts of funny ideas about the Telegraph. It was a very, very comfortable, nice paper to work on, for me anyway. I had almost no pressure at all, as far as I recall, from the Telegraph. I had advice and I had encouragement in the early days, not so much in the later ones. I felt very much sort of supported by my colleagues on the Telegraph. I do remember my first editor, who was called Maurice Green. Can't remember quite when he left, in the early 70s perhaps. And him saying to me, could you just lay off Vietnam a little bit, just not every day. And I can remember Max Hastings saying to me somewhat similarly, just lay off John Major. We're overdoing the sort of attacks on John Major, the sort of laughing, mocking him. But this wasn't pressure. They were right. I was overdoing it, or it was a bit too easy perhaps to do that. I had to sort of think a bit more widely. But otherwise, the other editors, I recall no pressure at all.
Did they ever come to you with good ideas for cartoons? I know that some cartoonists, Andy Davey on the Sun, lives in fear of the good idea that is brought to him for a cartoon.
If they did, they came. I mean, I can remember once or twice, I think, an editor or deputy editor coming to me saying, "I've got an idea," but they did it in such a way that didn't make it difficult to say, "I don't think so." There are very, very few people who are not cartoonists who have good cartoon ideas. They might have extremely good analysis of the politics, and they may occasionally be able to link a political idea with a famous painting or a moment in history or something like that. It's pretty simple, and in that case it's sort of working well. But when they say, look, I think you ought to do a cartoon about such, and so what you have is all the people on this side of the hill, and the other side of the hill you can see people doing that, and in the distance, in other words, it gets bigger and bigger and more impossible to draw. People don't think in the sort of economic way that cartoonists think. So mostly if people come with ideas, they're useless.
Were you seen as a political outsider at the Telegraph? Because your background is, well, certainly your parents, you've talked about them as being communists.
They were communists, yeah.
And so you've talked in the past about your friends being surprised when you went to the Telegraph. Mm-hmm. And presumably at the Telegraph you would be seen as to the left.
Yes.
But then you were also working, say, in the 70s for the New Statesman, and Anthony Howard's talked of you as my right flank. That's the kind of. So, is it appealing to you to be in that position on a paper, to be slightly off centre, whatever that centre is politically?
For a short while, when I worked on The Independent, I realised I was missing that place, as it were, on some sort of. I don't know how to finish this sentence. Of being sort of out of kilter with the newspaper. I preferred that. It was fun, and while the paper, the Telegraph, was obviously extremely right wing. No, that's wrong. It's not extremely right wing. It was a particular kind of right wing. It was a rather kind of idiosyncratic, romantic kind of right wingery. It wasn't true of the old Telegraph when I joined it, and right up until quite recently, that they also thought of themselves to some extent as a kind of forum in which all sorts of arguments could be discussed. I mean, the person doing the leader page article might be anybody. I remember there was a leader page article by Willie Shawcross before he became rather more right wing, in which he expressed the view that Kissinger and Nixon should both be charged with war crimes because of what they did in Vietnam and Cambodia and so on. And I do remember Reg Sneed, who was at the paper at that time, he was absolutely sort of exploding with rage at the idea that this was expressed in the columns of the Daily Telegraph. So the Telegraph wasn't anything like as kind of shut down right-wing proselytizing pamphleteering newspaper. It was a very good newspaper with all kinds of things written in it. And among other things, they had cartoons that weren't always all that sort of right wing, but they were signed. That was me saying this, not the Telegraph. And I do remember Bill Deeds, when he was editor, when he got letters, which he did, complaining about my cartoons, he had a little letter that went out to people. I think he just said to his secretary, "Send out the letter," kind of thing. And basically, it said, "We do not employ Mr. Garland to illustrate our editorials." I thought it was a nice way of putting it.
Was libel ever a constraint of any sort for you? Libel. I mean, it's something which newspapers have always to be concerned about, but did it ever have any influence on what you were doing?
I think there's very, very few times when a politician has actually sued a cartoonist. He would make such a complete sort of ass of himself if he did.
So what impact cartoons can have, what impact they do have, and how you know whether they're having an impact, because that's a completely different question as to the feedback that comes from readers and politicians or editors. So what impact can cartoons have? Do you think they can change opinions of readers or politicians?
I think I have to go back a little bit. I think there was a time when an individual cartoon could have more impact than it can nowadays. I mean, there are famous occasions when individual cartoons had an impact, like the price of petrol has gone up. Everybody cites that. You know what I'm referring to, obviously. And there may occasionally be a cartoon that sort of, over years, has lodged in people's memories. Very Well Alone, and Dropping the Pilot, and Please Sir, I Want Some More, or whatever. These things just sort of become somehow. But it's very, very rare for an individual cartoon to have a great deal of impact.
Yes.
Cartoons are part of a democratic process. They take their place somewhere in the whole way it works. It's extremely noticeable if you ever travelled in the old Soviet Union or in any sort of certain third world countries where you have very authoritarian governments. You don't get political cartoons criticising the government, because people would immediately get shot or tortured or disappear into a horrible prison. But in our system and in the United States, in the West generally, it's part of the process that you are allowed to say that politicians are foolish or wrong, maybe even that they are evil. And that's accepted and it's necessary. And it's it always sort of tends to take the top off the authority of politicians. We are not afraid of our politicians. And partly that is that sort of lack of fear or respect or whatever is manifested in the way we cartoon them. So it's playing a terrifically important part in our democratic process, the freedom of our press and the freedom of our expression of judgments and views on our politicians.
So would you argue that the impact of a cartoonist should be judged through a whole series of cartoons looking at particular political ideas rather than one single image? Is it possible to judge a cartoonist by one single image, or do you have to look at a...
I mean, there may be, a cartoonist may produce a cartoon that you think is particularly good, and therefore it lodges in your mind in some way. But I think the effect, if there is an effect, I think there's very little effect actually. That's not the point of them. Is not to affect or to influence people. They're not going to be influenced by cartoons. They may have their ideas reinforced or in some way sort of bolstered or strengthened by the way people draw the politicians. But I don't think they look to cartoons for influence. I don't think that's quite how they work. Famously, recently, Steve Bell and his underpants stuff, but that was about John Major. John Major was widely believed to be this grey person who sort of strangled the English language and didn't have a sort of Oxbridge accent, and these clothes were sort of awful, and his haircut was absolutely terrible. So I mean, Steve was part of that, but Major didn't eventually stumble because of the underpants. What I think cartoons do is not sort of lead. They don't tell people what's going on or how to think about it. They react to what's going on. It's like holding up a mirror, something like a distorting mirror, to things that have already happened. Cartoons are not the vehicle for introducing brand new ideas or describing events for the first time. They are always counterpunches. They are always responding to things that people already know.
To what extent do cartoonists move together as a group to make those points?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because they do, of course. I mean, I can't speak for my colleagues. The first thing I turn to in the morning in all the papers, what did the other guys do? Look at them, partly to make sure you don't do the same thing that day, or the next day, to see how they responded to the day's news, because you were doing it 24 hours ago. Partly to see what you could steal in the way of how likenesses or sort of ideas that you might be able to do a variation on. I found it very stimulating to look at my colleagues' or competitors' work. So because of that, I think there's an inevitable influence, probably not very conscious, and sometimes very conscious, You can sometimes see, oh, that guy's, he's been looking at Peter, or he's been looking at Dave.
In terms of the caricatures of political figures, particularly internationally known figures like prime ministers, it's always interesting to look at the cartoonists of other countries and see that German cartoons of John Major,
almost unrecognisable.
Almost unrecognisable to us, but they will resemble other German cartoons of John Major.
That's right.
And there is a sense in which cartoonists in a country seem to reflect ideas or bounce ideas off each other, not steal from each other or borrow from each other, kind of go forward together, exploring different possibilities. Is that something?
For the reasons you're given, the reasons I'm giving, this happens. It just happens. We're too familiar with each other's work, I think, for it not to happen. And sometimes it's conscious. Like I was saying before, I began to change my style because technology had altered what was possible, and you had this other guy, Bell, who was exploiting that new technology so well. How could you not? And it seemed like the sensible thing to do was to go down that road. So I was aware of that influence.
That's an interesting example of the impact that cartoons can have on other cartoonists. How do you know what impact they have on politicians or readers? What's the feedback that comes to you after a cartoon is published?
Some politicians collect cartoons. They enjoy them and like them, rather than the way I do. They like caricatures and they like the jokes and things. Macmillan had a huge collection of Vicky's cartoons, for instance, and there are certain collectors among politicians, but that's not quite the same as being influenced by them or whatever. I think for a politician to be cartoon, to appear in a political cartoon, is a sign they've arrived, and that's pretty important. It's like getting your name in lights if you're an actor or something like that. You're big enough to be known, to be recognised, and to be a player. So sometimes when you have a politician who's just arrived and he's being cartooned for the first time, he likes to. I had a very sweet thing the other day when I was asked by a woman, rang up and asked for the original. Could she buy the original of a caricature, a cartoon I'd done that had a young politician in it? And I said yes, and we were chatting for a while on the telephone. And I said it's unusual for a wife to be collecting cartoons like this of her husband. And she said, "Oh, I'm not his wife, I'm his mother." And I thought it was very sweet.
But there are some cartoonists, though, who I think if they felt politicians' mothers were buying the images that they were drawing of their sons, they would be rather sort of frustrated that their attacks were not landing home.
Those are the people who are taking themselves far too seriously. They think that their cartoons are having an effect out there, and that people are sort of scared of them or something. And the fact that the subject might want to even buy the cartoon from them, or his mother might, or her mother might, makes them think, "Oh, I've failed." But that's because they've got a fatuous idea of their own importance. It doesn't work like that.
What feedback do you get from readers? You spoke about letters coming in that the editor would reply to, yes. But do you get a lot? Do you get a lot of feedback like that? There were
always some letters. I never even saw them,
really?
Because the letters editor was fielding them, or there's not letters to me, but letters just to the paper. There were always a few of them. I think probably fewer in more recent years. There was a time when during the time when Rhodesia was being led in rebellion by Ian Smith, and I was forever doing pictures of Ian Smith, who I thought was a terrible sort of apartheid racist kind of guy. He probably wasn't anything like as bad as I thought he was, but I mean, seeing what came later. But but I know that I stimulated a lot of angry letters about that, because people really admired that man, and I clearly didn't. But now and again, there'd be a sort of issue, a matter, a thing that tended to get a lot of letters, but not much to me. I never got many letters from readers.
So you didn't see yourself as in a dialogue with readers in any way? No.
And the people who bothered to write letters, who went to all the trouble to go and get a pen and a bit of paper and an envelope and a stamp and then post it, I mean, there aren't many of those. Sometimes terribly nice letters from people who touched me very much indeed, but there were very few.
Okay, the final couple of questions really were going to be simply about the tradition of cartooning, whether there is a British tradition of cartooning, whether it's a tradition in which you see yourself as working, and where you see that tradition going. Some cartoonists do. I mean, Steve Bell, I think, would see himself in this 200-year tradition of something which is particularly British, and within which his work sits, but makes reference to earlier cartoons and cartoonists. Do you think that that's a place in which you saw yourself?
I think that's a bit grandiose, don't you? Do you see yourself in some tradition of 200 years of people interviewing people or something? I don't think so. I mean, you just get on with the job, don't you? Mostly I think of when I was a cartoonist or a practicing one, my main concern was thinking of an idea and then drawing it as well as I possibly could going home. I tended not to think of myself as being part of some huge tradition.
But they're part of a broader cultural context to your cartoons, because they make all these references to theatre,
Sure.
to books,
Yeah.
to other visual arts.
Yeah.
It's a kind of, they are in a context, but it's not this particular cartooning context, a kind of British tradition.
Not particularly. I don't think I particularly formulated that idea. I mean, if I, in a way, yeah, there was Tenniel was drawing political cartoons, and now I am. But
Yes,
there's not much sort of connection between the two of us. And
I've probably got my archivist's hat on too much here, as seeing.
in one way, of course, I'm part of a traditional thing, and we Brits like to claim that as ours. But the French were very, very good political cartoonists. The Japanese were very good. The Americans had a long, long tradition of political cartoons going way back, almost as long as ours. So, they could all say, the Germans, great political cartoons.
The other question then, not looking backwards but looking forwards, would be, do you have any sense, any feeling, any hopes about the future of political cartooning? You've seen a great number of changes over your career. Changes in the style of presentation of newspapers, in the illustration of newspapers, in the layout. And now we have a time when the newspaper itself may be under threat, that the way in which text and images come together in the news is changing with the internet.
Well, I've been talking recently with several people about the death of the political cartoon, and it may well be that it is drawing peacefully to a close, partly for that reason and partly for other reasons. I mean, I've already said that there was a time 40 years ago, maybe 45 years ago, when a cartoon stood out in the paper in a way it couldn't possibly nowadays. It's in competition with brightly coloured adverts, any number of little pictures of the authors of the articles that are appearing, other little graphic logos and blue boxes around certain articles, changes in typeface and so on. There's a kind of visual cacophony, I don't know quite what the word would be, that the cartoon is in competition with. And to the extent that is true, the sort of high profile and clarity of the cartoon is lost. And to some extent, I think there was a time when cartoons were one of the major sources of information for citizens. They knew what politicians looked like because of the cartoons. Nowadays, they know what they look like because of very, very high quality pictures in newspapers and magazines and, of course, television.
I suppose also there was a time when the newspaper cartoon was the only place to go for a sort of irreverence about politics as well.
Yes, that's true.
Whereas that now has leached out into press photography, in particular in newspapers.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
the politician caught unawares and shown in a ridiculous way is now a kind of staple of press photography as well as cartooning.
And that has also lent possibly got something to do with the way cartoons have become more grotesque or explicit, because they're in competition with so many other satirical views or sort of images or whatever that are being sold around the streets. I think there was a time when the political message, the actual political analysis that there was in a cartoon, was really what was important. You could place a cartoonist such as Illingworth or Lowe or Vicky somewhere or Cummings on a political spectrum. Nowadays it's a little bit more difficult to do that, partly because the spectrum itself has altered. There isn't a sort of left-right division in the way there used to be. Left people and right people can come together on certain issues in a way that didn't used to happen so much. So the whole sort of role and place and society that political cartoons are appearing in is different. Consequently, cartoons are different, and I have no idea whether they will survive the destruction of newspapers. I would guess not very much. Not very much.
If you look to the future for yourself, your political cartooning, is that going to continue, develop, change, reappear, or is it something you're happy to lay aside and move on, or move back to other things?
I was sad to lay it aside. I was very, very sad when it came to an end. But it has, and so I have no future in political cartooning. I haven't any ambition in that direction.
It's interesting that this room isn't full of political material. This room is full of visual material and tactile material and these little kind of shrines of objects. Is this something you'll be going back to?
Well, I've always had two things going in my life while I was a cartoonist. One is sort of harks back to my days as an art student when I was a painter and a printer, and the other is a cartoonist. This room where you're sitting now is my painting studio, my printing studio. I did very little cartooning in here. That's why it doesn't seem to reflect my interest in cartooning.
Has it been deliberately kept out of here? Because all you need to do is step out of the door, and it kind of.
If you look through the bookshelves, you would find cartoon books here. As soon as you step out the door, you'll find drawings by cartoonists, by Vicky. Yeah. By Illingworth, by Steve Bell, by others, or Richard Winnington.
I'm not trying to do some complicated psychological analysis. No, different rooms and.
It doesn't. It just. This is where I paint. This is where
it seems a very pleasant space.
There's no sort of apartheid here. I would like to raise one thing about cartoons, and that is about the word cartoon.
Yes.
Which in the English language means something. Frivolous, something jokey, something funny. It's just a sort of accident of history that we use that word for cartoons, as you know. In French, the word for a cartoonist is caricaturiste, and the Russians use the same word, which doesn't suggest necessarily anything funny. It could be rather acid or sharp or critical. The fact is that people sometimes say things about a cartoon. Isn't it very difficult always being so funny? And you say to them, just take a look at political cartoons. Something like, probably the majority of them are not funny at all. They are. If this mirror is being held up, it's being held up to something appalling. Quite often cartoons are sort of grieving or shuddering at how awful something is, particularly these days when there are so many awful things around the world. There are terrorists, and there are very authoritarian governments, and there are terrible problems, maybe natural ones like tsunamis or earthquakes and so on. And cartoonists deal with these things seriously and in a concerned kind of way. And we are not anything like a sort of giggling, frivolous people. Most cartoonists are really quite serious men. Yeah. They can be very funny sometimes, but so can anybody. It's just a sort of small point I would like to make, because there's a view that cartoons are jokes, but anybody who studies them or looks at them will find that's not true. They're not. It's a form of reflecting to people a view of current events that they've already thought about, and here's another way of thinking about them, or a slightly distorted or altered viewpoint.
Yes, we are saddled as an archive with a word which does not reflect either what the range of material that we have or the focus of material that we have. There have been suggestions of kind of changing it to, I don't know what you'd choose.
Well, satire is quite a useful word.
Graphic satire?
Because that doesn't that suggests something a bit more sharp, a bit more critical, or possibly sort of acid. But even that doesn't include the kind of solemn cartoons. What Vicky used to do, a lot of them, they were known as his Oxfam cartoons, famously. And some in cartoons talk about weeping statues cartoons. You've got to fall back on a weeping statue, because what are you going to do when...
And stylistically they're quite different.
Yes, usually they are. The artists become a bit more kind of academic and kind of precise in their execution. It's true.